I said at the beginning of my remarks that the interdependence of nations across the broad spectrum of issues, climate change, poverty, banking system, whatever you want, means that good global governance requires a global steering committee. I believe that's why this is a watershed moment. But that being said, there is one essential element, and I've discussed this with John Curt and Madeleine Koch, who are here, and a number of people ad nauseum. There is one essential element that the new steering committee requires if it is going to succeed. And that is, to make globalization work, the leaders are going to have to be able to rise above the political comfort of narrow nationalism. Margaret Macmillan yesterday, in her remarks, I'm told, went back and spoke about the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. I think that one can argue pretty strongly that that's when the modern era began. In the Treaty of Westphalia really came the first definition of sovereignty, the sovereignty of nations. It was a definition that was limited essentially to rights. It is my belief that that definition has to be extended now to include duties and the responsibility of nations to each other. Well, the truth is, given the interdependence of nations, establishing international norms, establishing international standards is the only way now of protecting national sovereignty. And if the West doesn't understand this today, it is going to do it tomorrow. The fact is that the two largest banks in the world are Chinese. Many of the fastest growing banks in the world right now are in emerging economies, and a great number of those banks are undercapitalized. The fact that the situation of the Chinese banks is well known. It's written about every single day, that having made loans to state-owned companies to basically finance the property bubble of their own, that they've got the same problem. Well, now it's isolated to China. That's fine. But just think what's going to happen if in 5 years from now, as those Chinese and the Indian and Brazilian economies grow and continue to penetrate our economies as we have penetrated theirs. What's going to happen if there's a bank failure, a major bank failure in China or India or Brazil? Well, I will tell you, there will not be a stimulus package big enough to restart our economies. Our economies are hopefully getting going because of the increase in the price of commodities because of China. But as our economies become more and more interrelated, as we become more and more dependent upon them, the answer that we're finding in this particular one and we're having difficulty with is going to be much more difficult. And what that means that given this, the time to resolve these potential threats are now when we have the opportunity to do so. There are huge gaps in the global system. And what is required is an international body to monitor systemic risk throughout the world so that a banking failure in one country doesn't cause a banking failure in another, to monitor systemic risk across borders, and to prevent regulatory capture. Now, I don't want to go into mind-numbing detail, but I'm going to. But just because I think it is so important to talk about these issues. I'm saying that we've got to set up an international body that is essentially going to regulate the regulators. And the reason is that what happens, and it's what really happened in the United States, I think, and partially in Europe, but certainly in the United States, is that there's a thing called regulatory capture, that the regulators become captured by the industries within which they are. And I believe that what you have to do is have an international body that will monitor the regulators to prevent this kind of regulatory capture. And I think the way to do this is twofold. One, it's going to involve peer review, which is to say, for the sake of discussion, that 3 countries would be named. I don't care. France, Thailand, and Korea would monitor the regulatory system in Canada, and then Canada and 2 other countries would monitor the one in the United States. In order to have, and I've got to say that this peer review has to be done by regulators. Those of you who are graduates in economics, a couple of you asked questions yesterday. You will forgive me for saying this, but we really do not need a fresh-faced graduate from Harvard. What we really need is a miserable, mean regulator, somebody with a lot of experience who's going to come in and do this kind of thing. The second thing. Well, I didn't graduate in economics. That's why I became finance minister. The second thing that we need is the mandatory enforcement of rules. Now here, let me tell you, this mandatory enforcement of rules, I think I am in a minority. I've had the opportunity, and I'm sure Michael has, to talk to the various players, and I'm not sure everybody would agree with me on this, but let me explain to you my position. What the Basel Committee is recommending is that the international standards be set, that we do the peer review, and then that the peer review would essentially come across a country that was violating the rules, whose regulations didn't live up to the international standards. And then what they would do is they would publish that. This is what the IMF does. They would publish it, publicly shaming the countries which don't live up to the rules. My own belief is that public shaming of a country doesn't work. First of all, you can't shame most of the major powers. You cannot shame a major power. And so the only way in which you're going to deal with this is if you're going to have an enforcement mechanism. And I won't take the time now, but if you want to in the question period discuss it, there are enforcement mechanisms. None of them are going to be very acceptable. But I can tell you, we cannot continue in the kind of world in which we live now unless we recognize that capital operates without borders. And we are going to have a regulation process that operates without borders. Now, in fact, the body to do this has been created. It's called the Financial Stability Board. However, its authority has not been determined. It's clearly understaffed, and most countries don't belong to it. And so I also believe that at the Korean summit, this is another issue that is going to have to be decided. Now this, by the way, you'll mind, I'm going to just read something that I said here at Cpac. You said you were here, Gwen. But I mentioned to you didn't remember. You didn't listen to me. So the problem is that this is talking about the Asian crisis. The combination of imprudent domestic banking practices together with globalization ensures that in each and every case, the fallout is felt not just in the country of cause, but around the world as well. And so where does the solution lie? Even the most libertarian among us has long since acknowledged the need for banking regulation to protect us from the excesses of an unfettered market. Given that these tools are welcomed, and they certainly are in Canada and in most countries within our borders, by what logic would we not seek their development beyond those borders? Now, the question that I would put to you, I put 10 years ago, and I still think it's valid, is why would we build an international model that has all the market freedoms of our national economies, but none of its protections? That's the issue in terms of the financial crisis that the G20 has to answer. But it's true not only in terms of bank regulation. It's true, albeit far too late, in terms of climate change, in terms of famine, in terms of global poverty, in terms of all of the issues that we face, all the issues that transcend our borders, because the threat of contagion in each of these areas is universal. It knows no exceptions. And as a result, I believe that the recasting of sovereignty to include its duties maybe the most important role the G20 can play, and that's why I said I think it is a watershed. And it won't be easy, but clearly it is the key to making globalization work. And I hope that we can discuss this as well in the period that's going to follow. Thank you very much. We're prepared to understand that, in fact, we're all going to have to give up a little bit of our sovereignty in order to make the world work.